Gerrymandering, a battle for democracy. The Congress of the United States and the state's legislators that accompany them all have a purpose in American democracy. Whether it is the U.S. House, the Ohio House, the U.S. Senate, or the Ohio Senate, voters send fellow citizens to these bodies in hope for proper representation. That is the idea behind these bodies. The explanation of the overall goal of these representative bodies is an interesting one, no doubt about it. But the structure behind them is something that many people, such as myself, find remarkably interesting also. By structure, I mean, how many people make up these different bodies? What is that number based upon? How are the lines for each representative district decided? What is the importance of that factor? How do individual states handle the structure behind these bodies? Those are all very important questions. That have answers that our representatives' government look to hide and seem to have successfully done so for decades now. Every 10 years in the United States, a process known as redistricting takes place. It is a process that in most cases allows representatives to redraw congressional maps for the federal and state levels. 2022, this year, we actually saw the redistricting process unfold. And as Politico reporting shows, the amount of competitive districts that were up for election was the lowest in recorded history, meaning that the overwhelming majority of congressional races this year were either safe for the Republicans and Democrats respectively, with just a handful actually being considered as possible to go one way or the other. This process, like many other contrivances in American politics, does not come without controversy. Within the redistricting process is a poisonous, corrupt, and undemocratic abuse of power. That power is known as gerrymandering. Author Michael Lee and Annie Lowe describe gerrymandering as the intentional manipulation of district boundaries to discriminate against a group of voters on the basis of their political views and or race. In their article for the Brennan Center, What is Extreme Gerrymandering? Gerrymandering is abused mostly by states' legislators to benefit themselves in elections to come, to favor their party. In a sense, it is representatives choosing leaders over the people. It does not get more undemocratic than that. And yes, the U.S. is not a true democracy. The Electoral College is proof of it. A country that instead of voting directly for president, votes for people to represent their vote and hopefully respects the will of that voter is a strange system and a country that touts its democratic track record. But I digress. The U.S., as I stated earlier, is not a true democracy. Instead, it is a constitutional republic, which in the American government's eyes means there's leeway with respect for people's decisions on their representatives. Well, yes, America, as previously stated earlier, is not a true democracy, meaning there are certain principles it does not follow on par to other great democracies such as Rome. But we still pride ourselves on popular sovereignty. Every chance a politician or someone in a position of power gets to express the moral gratitude one could receive by voting. We almost also live in a modern-day culture where if you do not vote, you are frowned upon, and the extremes blame set individuals for costing their candidates those elections. As the founder, arguably, of modern-day gerrymandering, Thomas Hofeller describes it, redistricting is an election in reverse, continuing by saying, usually the voters get to pick the politicians, and redistricting, the politicians get to pick the voters. I feel as if the corruption and undemocratic features are already very clear by this description of Mr. Hofeller. Yes, we live in an indirect democracy. That does not mean our elected officials should be able to rig the system in their favor just because during the redistricting process their party happened to be in the majority. What furthers the irritation of this, beyond the already previously mentioned corruption, is the fact that once maps are redistricted, unless challenged successfully in the court, which by the way is also very rare, they are in formation for the next decade, 10 years. 10 years in which a party can decide to dominate a state's electoral politics because a member of the state's legislature decided to draw those to certain precincts to already existing districts to benefit their party, and never would those precincts be voting areas for the opposing party. Republicans and Democrats are guilty of this vile behavior in their own way. My own congressional district is an example of a gerrymandered district. The 12th District of Ohio cuts off a sliver of Franklin County, a Democratic voting county. North and east of Franklin, the lines go continuously, almost towards the Appalachia section of the state, in a jigsaw sort of pattern. Throwing in the excess counties with a history of voting for GOP candidates such as Richland, Licking, and Knox counties. My representative, Troy Balderson, in the 2020 election, won 55% of the overall vote in his district, while winning just under 40% of the vote in Franklin County. One could also make the argument that voters in northern Franklin County and in Knox County have different priorities, therefore they need representation in an appropriate manner. Nonetheless, the shoddy system cannot go unignored by American voters any longer. The problem is in plain sight, and it must be addressed. Vice President Elbridge Gerry was arguably the first man in 1812 to gerrymander a political map. When as governor of Massachusetts, he signed a bill to favor his party, ironically, the Democratic Republican Party, in the upcoming state Senate elections. Critics of gerrymandering thought it would only be appropriate then to name the corruption system under the former vice president's name, with the historic beginning of gerrymandering. What followed next was the racial suppression of minority voters because of the system. Author Kim Soffen from the New York Times, in her article, How Racial Gerrymandering Deprives Black People of Political Power, describes the Civil Rights Act of 1965 that during the redistricting process, districts and states shall be drawn, putting at least one district, if possible, a majority-minority presence, later appropriately being labeled as majority-minority districts. The sentiment at the time being, minorities could now finally be given the chance to have a say in voting for people that actually gave a darn about them. Before this, states like Louisiana and Georgia, with large black populations, were already disenfranchised and represented by segregationist Southern Democrats that did not put African Americans' well-being at the same level as their white constituents. This was found later to be a benefit due to the Republican Party due to their usually lackluster performance amongst minorities, especially African Americans. The drawing of these huge majority-minority districts had the effect of making some adjacent districts less Democratic and more Republican-leaning in some instances. In 2016, the Republican-led Virginia state legislature was sued by Golden Bethune-Hill after the legislature made their majority districts only 55% African American. And memos being released from the Virginia House of Delegates shows the body used race as a deciding factor in redistricting. Thomas Hofeller was a member of the RNC in the 1990s and was tapped by Massachusetts Republicans to take advantage of the provision in the Voting Rights Act by drawing a map in deep blue Massachusetts that isolated the city of Boston to, well, itself, in hopes that the Republican surrounding districts would become just that, more Republican. It appears that even long after Mr. Hofeller was in the public eye, his maps were being enacted in the redistricting process by GOP legislators, as stated by David Daley from The New Yorker. Hofeller's baby of a project perhaps had to be his work in North Carolina, a state that has changed so much culturally since the turn of the century, and Mr. Hofeller noticed that. Mr. Hofeller collected race data from college students in North Carolina to precisely draw majority-minority districts and benefit the Republican Party in the adjacent districts. The U.S. Court of Appeals from the 4th District found that the North Carolina map was unconstitutional because it violated the Constitution by making race a main factor in the process. The court ordered the state to redraw its districts, with the previous map only existing for roughly 5 years. Do you see a pattern here? Race, by a number of state houses, is being used in the redistricting process unconstitutionally. Racism, on top of the already proven corruption portion of gerrymandering, shows the ridiculousness of the process even more. The fact that race is an issue being abused in such a way is repulsive. What is the solution to it all? Well, the answer is quite simple, actually. Some states, such as California, have nonpartisan independent commissions that decide the redistricting process to erase any chance of parties taking advantage of the minority part, or for that matter, minority citizens. Our group decided, though, that we would take the conversation a bit further and address the already existing framework of independent commissions by firstly beginning grassroots campaigns to petition in every U.S. state to implement these commissions, then putting that idea as an initiative on the ballot in the next general election. If this initiative saw great success and support from Republicans, Democrats, and independents of the like, we then would push even further by forcing the commission to draw a minimum of 3 maps and then put those maps up for a vote for the people in their respective states. There's your popular sovereignty, you bureaucrats in Washington. In all seriousness, we must say this idea was the most democratic version of the process any group has come up with. The Campaign Legal Center has collected existing independent commissions as voter-centric reforms to ensure that voters, not politicians, decide how electoral districts are drawn. There's your democracy in action. Gerrymandering is just another example of how we as Americans allow the government in the freest country in the world to take advantage of us. We must, as a people, stand up and prove to our representatives that we are not ignorant sheep, and we have the ability to kick them out if they do not follow common sense values. We must band together in a grassroots faction to end gerrymandering altogether. Let's put Congress on their toes for once. Thank you.
That's good.